Welcome to the Northern Ireland Affairs Select Committee session on the impact of the autumn budget on the farming sector in Northern Ireland. And I'd like to welcome Richard Beattie, William Irvine and Peter McCann. Unfortunately, Jeremy Moody isn't available online because of technical problems our end, so we hope that he might be able to pop up. Thank you for coming. I know it's been a difficult time. Would you like to outline to me the impact that the autumn budget has had on the farming community in Northern Ireland? I'll start with yourself, William.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for this opportunity to talk about Northern Ireland agriculture. The budget changed the agenda drastically within Northern Ireland. Agriculture within Northern Ireland moves about £6 billion worth through our economy. So it is massively significant in a small province like ourselves. It is the agricultural pound reaches every sector of Northern Ireland's communities, and as an industry, the farms are predominantly owner occupied. We don't have a tenanted sector within agriculture. Our farms tend to be, our average farm size is 100 acres, but our average value per acre is extremely high. And this combination of factors, in our view, leaves Northern Ireland impacted to a greater extent than other parts of the UK.
And Peter, how have you seen the community now?
Yeah, the autumn budget, I suppose the inheritance tax, agricultural property relief, has got a lot of the headlines, no doubt about it, but of course I'm sure we'll talk about that extensively later. But there are other issues too around the farm budget. That pot of money for agricultural support is no longer ring fenced. Instead of being set by the Treasury in London, now by our friends in Belfast. So there's some uncertainty around that, potentially some benefits in that, given that does seem to be a lot of political appetite among our parties in Northern Ireland to support farmers, but still some uncertainty. Other issues as well about double cap pickups no longer getting the full allowance on them for your income tax calculations. The carbon border adjustment mechanism is effectively a tax on fertiliser. Varying approaching £50 to £70 a tonne it could be from January 27. And the other thing that maybe is lost in a lot of this as well, the national insurance thing. You know, a lot of farms in Northern Ireland are large businesses. They'll be affected by that too, by having to have higher contributions. So that, plus obviously the inheritance tax thing, is massive as well.
Richard?
Yeah, certainly from our membership, we're very reluctant to see the budget in terms of effects of the change in APR. Certainly from a young farmer's point of view, we're very much trying to push succession, and certainly a lot of our members, we're looking at a very well educated membership. We've encouraged our ones to go for further education, and it's certainly whenever they start crunching the numbers and some of these things, it really looks at, well, are we going to go home to a farm business that's viable, and potentially a huge inheritance tax bill that they can't work with going into the future farming careers. And that's really the apprehension we're seeing from our members in that regard, and also those directly working in the rural areas and involved in agri-food processing. Like, there's 115,000 jobs within Northern Ireland are directly employed from agri-food businesses, and ultimately if the farmer level of their output is potentially reduced, there's also reducing chances of employability there further down the line. So there's really, from a young person point of view, there's a real fear and apprehension, should I be taking up a career in agriculture at the minute.
Thank you. Gavin?
Thanks very much, Chair, and good afternoon, gentlemen. Peter, you write for the Irish Farmers Journal, and you had an article on Saturday the 7th, so Saturday past, which I found fascinating, but I'm going to invite you to explain it to members. And for the evidence session today, you indicated that HMRC had released clarification on the agricultural property relief, which contradicted the Treasury position that it would be the 50% was on relief rather than estate values, is that correct? Or is it on estate values and not on relief? Could you explain to the committee how that clarification may give a more positive interpretation of a bad situation than what
I suppose it is helpful, but it's certainly not a get out of jail card at all. Probably maybe the main takeaway from it is, as you say, how Treasury and HMRC were effectively saying two different things, or at least it wasn't very clear at all, you know. And that maybe tells us something about the guidance, and maybe even tells us something about the amount of thought that went into this policy to begin with, and not in budget, you know. So the clarification from HMRC is that the 50%, so until now, is obviously 100% relief from agricultural property under APR. The proposed change is that 100% relief remains £2 million. After that, it's a 50% relief, and the clarification is that that 50% relief applies to the value of the APR or BPR qualifying asset, the farm, the land, stock, whatever. That's different to maybe how some initial guidance suggested it was applying to the tax rate. So instead of a 40% inheritance tax rate, it was going to be 20%. Just when you crunch a few numbers, do a few worked examples, the clarification does help in certain circumstances. It'll help reduce the tax burden on some farms slightly, maybe not hugely, and in some cases it will help some farms get away from the inheritance tax burden completely. But again, it's still a huge issue, but certainly a bit of a clarification is welcome. And it maybe also shows how tinkering around the edges of this policy and how it's implemented and different other things we maybe could do, you could help alleviate the impact of this without politically it being seen as a screeching U-turn by the Labour government.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's very helpful. I appreciate it. What is the makeup of Northern Ireland's farming sector in terms of land value, farm size and ownership?
I suppose that's maybe why I'm here. As part of my work with the Irish Farmers Journal, I'm a co-author of the Agricultural Land Price Report, and that's a magazine that comes out every year. It's the only independent analysis and survey of the agricultural land market in Ireland and Northern Ireland. So last year we found the average price was £13,794 an acre. Again, it's an average price. Beware of the thought of averages, as the saying is. So my survey, it ranged from £3,500 an acre to almost £46,000 an acre. So there's a huge variation there. For example, where William Farms in Armagh has notoriously been a land market hotspot, and County Down as well, the top 2 or 3 counties in Ireland every year. So in places like Armagh, the average price was £17,600 an acre, and 73% of the sales in our survey in that county were over £15,000 an acre. So compare that to the rest of the UK. You know, England, I've seen figures there, average land prices to £11,000. Scotland, arable land maybe £10,000, pasture land £5,000. Wales around 8,500. You know, so we're significantly higher ahead for various reasons. Like, a key reason is an extremely tight supply of land that comes on the market every year, and we've been doing this survey for 13 or 14 years. So last year, 11,370 acres. Sounds like a lot of land. I wish I owned it, but it isn't. Like, across the place like Northern Ireland even, which is a relatively small geographical area, it's about 0.54% of the agricultural land area. Now, that's publicly advertised land for sale. Yes, some land changes hands privately. We can't get a handle on that, but even if we estimated that number again, doubled it, you're still talking 1% of the land area that comes on the market, and that's a key reason why land prices in Northern Ireland are so expensive.
Peter, your figure there of an average cost per acre, that was for Northern Ireland, acres for sale. It contrasts with some other figures we've seen around £21,000 an acre in Northern Ireland. So I wonder, what's your sense of the reason for the variance even within the average figure?
No, well, I can explain that average figure. So are you talking about the DERA analysis there at £21,000 an acre? So what that is, we've done more than that. I should maybe clarify that. At the start, that 13,800 roughly is for bare land or clean land, just land on its own. So since this came out in the budget, we've done more analysis of our figures, redone them, and included farmhouses, farmyards, and farmyards are actually increasingly having a bigger impact or worth more value because of tight planning permission rules around ammonia and all that sort of stuff. So any kind of farmyard at all has an increasingly important role to play. So when we included houses, our sales included houses, yards, and things, it was well over £18,000 an acre. That's about 33% jump. Then to get the £21,000 that Dara have used, they're actually using some figures from their farm business survey, which gives an estimate of working capital. So that's your machinery, your livestock, etc. And they're also making a slight assumption of what land values will be in April 26. So when you do all that, and it's based on, firstly, our figures, which are watertight, I'll defend them to the hilt. Dara's farm business survey figures, that's where they're going in that figure of £21,000 an acre to include everything. And remember, that's what's included in these inheritance tax calculations. It's not just bare land.
Yeah, that's helpful, thank you. And the DAERA analysis states the traditional practice in Northern Ireland is that land on a farm tends to be owned by a single person. Is there data available to back up that claim?
Not that I know of, and not that DAERA know of, and I think the union would say the same, but anecdotally that would seem to be the case, and even I've seen some advice actually from Jeremy, who is joined us, said last week at an event, saying farms should check that out themselves because it all depends on whose deeds or whose name's on the deeds, and that's some advice that farmers even maybe don't even know that themselves of who exactly owns that bit of ground.
Thanks, Peter. William?
Yeah, well, just on that point, typically significant work on farms in Northern Ireland are 2 or 3 way partnerships for trading purposes, but actually the bulk of the collateral tends to be owned by the person that inherited of their previous generation, and that skews the effect of this and leaves the Northern Ireland vulnerable. The Treasury, we spoke to a Treasury spokesman along with the Secretary of State, and he said typically English farms are owned by 3 people, and that is absolutely not the case in Northern Ireland.
The last time you and I were on a farm, it was a limited company, I think.
Yeah.
How prevalent would that be in Northern Ireland agricultural?
I'll give you a precise figure, but not massively prevalent. It's more the exception than the norm.
Yeah, so I'd back that up. I work in the agri-food industry as well, from the family farm, and there's very few you be dealing with for fully limited companies.
Yeah. Just on, before I hand back to the Chair, if you don't mind, Chair, just on succession, Richard, how hard is it to get the older generations to pass their holding to the younger generation?
It's well, succession, we have done a lot of work with this. We had previously our land mobility scheme for young farmers going now. Rural Support is setting up their scheme, Farmer for the Generations. It's succession planning that's important for everybody and every business in that regard, but I think as businesses expand for younger people, there is that more conversation going there. So this
change has encouraged a discussion around tax planning and tax shielding and passing things and getting tapered relief over 7 years. And very often you hear farmers come back and say, concerned about who the son's in a relationship with and where that's going to go. And there's a reluctance there. There just seems to be this traditional reluctance about passing on. Like as a representative of young farmers, is that something that you try to engage with, work with, deal with?
Yeah, very much so. I think we do want to ensure that if the succession planning, well, for every business, like if you're a young person coming into the farm, and necessarily, for years it's like hereditary, it's the eldest son maybe inherited the farm, but maybe they didn't want it. There was a daughter or not a younger sibling that wanted to farm it, and that's whereby we encourage them conversations to have. Now, previously, you maybe did look at succession. It wasn't really, accountancy maybe wasn't encouraged or anything, whereas now, but succession is vitally important. But ultimately, where succession planning is looking at the minute, where we do look at the figures, potential tax bills that people want to pay, you have a generation looking at, well, I can't make this work, why would I take on this farm business? And that's the really scary thing we're seeing at the minute. We've done so much work for years to try and encourage succession, and suddenly one move in the change in APR, suddenly you're inheriting a business that's not financially viable.
Thank you, Chair. I think William wanted to come in, but I need to pass back, so I'll let you manage from here on. You go ahead, William.
Yeah, well, just to back up what Richard has just said, but as a body of people in Northern Ireland, farmers tended to invest every penny they had in their farm, and consequently, there's a significant portion of our members would not have private pensions. So part of the reluctance to hand over is to maintain income and lifestyle. Thank you.
Thank you, William. Claire Hannah.
Thank you very much. You're making a strong case that there will be a disproportionate impact on Northern Irish farmers, and DARA have said the same thing. Do you see a clear rationale for a specific Northern Ireland mitigation that would protect the principle that we're trying to achieve in terms of preventing big businesses or those using this as a workaround acquiring land, but that would protect the unique role that family farms have and occupy in our social and economic life? Do you see a clear rationale, and do you have proposals in that regard?
Yeah, I'll lead on that. I see this as a United Kingdom issue. I see it as a food security issue, and then when I think of home, I see us impacted to a greater extent. But I think we need a UK-wide solution to this issue, because food security is not a given.
Yeah, I suppose I'm not sure. Like, it'd be maybe unprecedented to maybe have a separate tax issue. I know. I'm just thinking back a few years ago. The corporation tax was potentially going to be a devolved matter, but so it would be a big step perhaps to have a Northern Ireland specific solution. But as William says, our friends and colleagues and the rest of the UK are impacted too. Look, honestly, there's various solutions. As I said to start there, some of them may be more politically acceptable at this stage. The government don't want to see a screeching U-turn. Ideally, yes, they could drop the whole thing. Listen, APR probably is due a bit of a reform. I think a lot of people would accept that, but it should really only be reformed after a detailed review or consultation. Other things they could do is they could lift that allowance from £1 million to something a bit more, realistic, to allow a lot more family farms through. Actually, an interesting proposal there from Tax Policy Associates a few weeks ago was to lift that threshold way up to maybe, they suggested maybe £20 million, and only have inheritance tax apply if, as a clawback mechanism, if the next generation sell the land. So that is fundamentally the issue. We have land, we have expensive assets, but we don't have cash. And, I'll not speak for all farmers, but I would just think that maybe is something that could be more acceptable in the farming community. If the generation does decide to cash it in, well, then maybe some of it should go back to the state. We're not against taxation. Real simple things, again, about the Gavin's question there about the 50% relief, kind of nerdy tax stuff, is that £1 million of APR, for some reason, isn't allowed to be transferable between spouses. Other inheritance tax reliefs are, like your nil rate band and your residence nil rate band. So even just allowing that to be transferable between spouses would actually make succession planning a lot less complicated on farms, because a farmer wouldn't feel the need to try and maximise the spouses' APR relief. It could be shared, and also it would mean that farms aren't passing to the next generation in two steps, which can be messy. At the end of the day, a married couple, a spouse can die, the other one can live for 20 or 30 years. That's not sustainable to have, a farm owned over two generations for that length of time or whatever. So it'll make it a lot less messy, it'll take a lot of the sting out of it, and again, it's just a real subtle change. It's not that could be beneficial. Sorry, Claire, just want to see my notes here. The other thing actually too is to amend that 7-year rule. So this will obviously potentially lead to a lot of lifetime gifts. Farmers passing the farm during their lifetime instead of waiting to death to avoid this inheritance tax. But as things stand, that 7-year rule is still there. So if that means that if the farmer died within 7 years, there could still be an inheritance tax bill. So if they amended that for a while, even on a temporary basis, it would allow a lot of farms to transfer to the next generation, and the farmer will be confident that if they die within 7 years, they won't still be hit with an inheritance tax bill.
In the Republic, they have the active farmer designation. Are there other examples elsewhere in Europe that you think can maybe be applied that help to ensure that we are supporting farmers and the aim of food security, but not facilitating those who are using this as a way to avoid tax?
I think in the south, yeah, like you're allowed a 90% relief, is it, off the top of my head? And the British Agricultural Bureau have a useful paper there comparing it across Europe, and the UK is by far going in a different direction from every other European country that they can see. Agriculture is treated as a special case, asset rich, cash poor.
Right around Europe, there's there's mitigations in place to help farms to stay within families and keep that generational thing going. And as Peter just said, this budget proposal steps away from the norm right round the whole European piece.
And finally, from me, and it might be I appreciate that this has come quite suddenly. Are there more thoughtful uses of things like APR that we could use, or is this creating a discussion for achieving other public policy objectives, maybe around sustainability and water protection and food security, that linking those taxes to some of the I suppose, functions and services that farmers are already and landowners are already doing?
Well, one of our frustrations, the way this budget sort of announced this massive change, is the lack of consultation. If there had been proper consultation, there could have been ways of raising more tax, but without putting the future of family farms at risk. And there could also be one of the issues for agriculture is the big business money coming in, basically on a tax dodge.
Yeah. And
for all the changes that's proposed within the budget, they're not actually closing that door. And that a genuine farmer would have no issue with that door being closed, and it's a frustration that it hasn't been closed. So proper consultation could have solved a lot of these issues.
I'm just thinking before, a good few years ago, it was George Eustace was in DEFRA, and he made a suggestion. Like, again, this will need to be thoroughly consulted on and looked at, but he made a suggestion that for people who do not farm their land, who let it out, to be eligible for APR, maybe the requirement should be that the land's leased out in a long-term lease rather than the Con-Acre system that's very common in Northern Ireland of one-year leases, and that gives farmers the confidence to invest in their land and has benefits in terms of agricultural production and the environment. So that's just a suggestion. It was on the table before. The Office of Tax Simplification did a detailed review on inheritance tax a few years ago. The 2019 report was published. Now, I remember looking closely at the time, is this something that they're going to recommend? But it wasn't, but again, it's a suggestion. It's something that maybe could be looked at. There could be, again, unintended consequences, but it's certainly, there's an idea there.
And if I may come in there, that proposal that Peter's just mentioned, that is a fantastic way to bring new entrants into the industry. It's a challenge to get new entrants in just because of the value of land, but a secure 5 or 8 year lease is with tax advantage to the landlord would ease that entry process for young entrants.
Just to add on that there, like we had our land mobility scheme within Northern Ireland, and that was the main barrier we had. It was setting them long-term leases for land for young people to enter into the industry. Again, succession, not everybody wants to take on the family farm. For certainly, it's an enjoyable career, but the return on investment's maybe not always there too. So there's ways and means where we can think the good suggestions there, and ultimately bringing people into the sector, producing food, and ultimately, if we're more productive, ultimately we'll increase our tax take too. If we're producing more produce locally, that's better for the whole sector and the whole economy. So I be full in support of that.
Thank you, Chair.
No problem. I just want to bring in Chris Blow in a supplementary.
Hi both. I'm just interested, you've both talked about the 7-year rule, and obviously we're talking a lot of generation of farmers who potentially are quite elderly, and they're very fearful of what that 7-year rule could imply for them, that perhaps they will not last the 7 years and the tapering doesn't happen till year 3 or year 4. I just wondered, are any of your members or any in the community already talking about receiving offers from corporate interests or organisations about purchasing land? Because that's one of the issues I've talked to a lot about with my farmers, is they're talking about having to sell off parts of their farm. And I just wondered, is that conversations already happening? Are those offers already happening within the community?
To a small extent, but I feel not as much as happens in other parts of the United Kingdom. And part of the reason for that is that we tend not to have as large of parcels of land for sale.
Okay.
if you're a big multinational company and there's 1,000 acres of marginal ground comes up and you can plant trees on it and feel very good about yourself forever, that ticks their box. But we tend not to have 1,000-acre plots of land for sale within Northern Ireland. But on a smaller scale, it is an issue.
And our figures back that up too, actually, that last year the average lot size, the average parcel of land that came on the market was 27 acres, and you would not believe how little that changes year on year. The year before it was 28, the year before that was 28. So as William says, if you're a big corporation on down the Thames there, you may as well buy a far larger parcel of land elsewhere, and also you can buy land cheaper elsewhere too. Like at 13 or 14,000 pounds an acre, you could buy 3 or 4 acres potentially of marginal land in Wales or Scotland. So.
Can I just quickly follow up on that? So, if farmers do make a decision to sell land to try and reduce the value of their farm and shield from IHT, are those farmers going to have trouble selling their plots of land because they're going to be quite smaller compared to the rest of the UK? Is that going to be an issue? Or?
I just don't think that'll actually happen. A farm, I just can't. Again, maybe the odd circumstance where a farmer would decide to sell, but that's fundamentally the issue we're talking about here. Is farmers don't want to have to sell that land. You'll try everything other than that to avoid this. You'll lifetime gifts, try and dodge a 7-year rule. Hopefully you live 7 years. The next generation should probably take out life insurance, because at the end of the day, none of us are guaranteed another day or hour. So that's actually the key issue that I have with this, is that that's actually fair enough to encourage lifetime gifts and allow younger farmers and take control of the farm. But as I say, the person who really get hit with this is the person who drops dead, age 40, age 50, with a young family, an active farm business, and a completely ruinous tax bill. The farm's over.
William wanted to come in then.
The farm that moves down a generation, or if you have to sell that, with average farm size at 100 acres within Northern Ireland, for a lot of farms they don't sell very much land till it puts the whole viability of their business in question. And that's really the sinister aspect. That we're unsure yet what this will do to land values, but the reality is there's always somebody that will want to buy it. Okay. But it's the fact that core farm business may not be viable following that sale.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Al Pinkerton.
Thank you, Chair. My question is to you, William, if I may, but thank you to all of you for joining us today. William, I believe that you had a meeting with DEFRA yesterday. Yes. That's certainly what we've been told. First of all, it would be really helpful for the committee if you happen to have had a transcript produced from that meeting yesterday, or any detailed notes that might have come out of that meeting, and whether you could lodge those with us for our records.
We have notes. We have no sort of word-for-word transcript as such, but we met with the Secretary of State for Environment and Agriculture, Steve Reid. He was well aware of the broader issues around this piece. I'm not sure that he was totally up to speed on the Northern Ireland specific impact, and that was why we walked through the door, to have the opportunity to explain that to him.
That was going to be my second question, and that was the extent to which the Secretary of State did in fact understand the Northern Ireland specific concerns that you were presumably trying to take to him yesterday.
It was a very constructive meeting. I felt at the end of the meeting he was much more over the detail of the Northern Ireland specifics than at the start, and he listened, and significantly he undertook to try and facilitate a meeting with ourselves and the Chancellor, and we really welcome that opportunity and welcome his help in achieving that.
That's really helpful, thank you. I think we'll probably
no problem. Thank you, Al. I just need to make everybody aware that we are expecting votes shortly, but we will resume after the votes. But we'll carry on. Katrina Murray.
Yeah, and normally this is the point where the bell starts ringing. Doing this. Now what I'm going to do is absolutely preface this as a dairyman's granddaughter, who the family moved out of. The family moved out of farming because we were tenant. It was tenant farmers in Galloway. So you've touched on this slightly, but absolutely for us all to be able to get a head around the combination. how the combination of the cap on agricultural property relief and business property relief will affect people who inherit the farming estates.
So, the main, in most cases, the main collateral is the land. But on an average working farm, there's quite a lot of additional capital tied up in livestock and the various kit that you need to make a farm work, and the usually farms live on site, so there's a house there, and that is the combination of all that have brought our Department of Agriculture DAERA to have put this £21,000 per acre figure on the value of a farm. And you know, if you were sitting looking at 100 acres of bare land today, unless you had either stock or the money to purchase stock or kit or the money to purchase kit, you couldn't actually make a living out of that land. you need the whole infrastructure to make it work.
Mm-hmm. And very much going on that, as I say, Northern Ireland, we are very much livestock intense. And if it's been there, it's very wet, great for growing grass, but it's the only thing we can, in that regard, really do. So going back to them DAERA figures, is the land value and the stock. To make it work, you need to really strongly invest between housing, livestock, and that really throws them figures up a lot in that regard.
And just listening to even the debate there last week on the non-binding motion, it's very clear that the Labour government is completely pinning this on these historic APR figures that you talked about there. And I just have to question, I just generally think the figures are wrong. And it makes sense that they're wrong too when you think about it, because these historic figures in APR, until now, for 40 years, the question was, is this a farm, does it qualify for 100% relief? It didn't really matter if the valuer valued that acre of land at 8,000 an acre or 20,000 an acre. It didn't really matter. In fact, even DAERA saying some of their correspondence to this committee and to DEFRA, it didn't matter if some of the land was even on the APR claim at all. And that maybe explains why the figures are so low. Even the DAERA analysis suggests there should be more like 7 times lower that acreage, that the suggested acreage is on those APR claims. So that's fundamentally what we're saying now, is if it's no longer 100% relief, even this 50% relief, it still really matters. Every pound has to be accounted for, especially if you're over that limit, that allowance. So every even bale of silage in the yard counts. A £30 bale of silage, there'd be £5 or £6 worth of tax in that. You know, there's no doubt about it. And even Jeremy's, some of the stuff that he said there recently is that the historic guidance from HMRC about the APR, and especially if a business was going through a full BPR claim, was that the value of the assets should be based on the farm tax accounts, which are historic values and almost certainly never market values, and that's what the inheritance tax bills going forward will be based on.
And just to back up what Peter says there and on Jeremy's piece of work, like very often those values that those are based on may have been put in place a generation ago, the last time that farm changed hands. So while the Treasury's calculation may well have been the correct calculation, if you start with the wrong figures, it's fundamentally flawed, and that, I think that is what has skewed this situation so much.
How is this going to affect the ability of farmers in Northern Ireland to pass farms on to their heirs?
In some cases, it's going to drive a coach and horses through it, and land will have to be sold, and the viability of what's left is in serious question.
And certainly going back from the young farmer point of view, like if you look at it, agriculture businesses historically offer 0.5% return on working capital compared to many other businesses, 20%. And certain many farms, there just isn't the cash to service that inheritance tax bill. And again, going back to the succession, if you sit down and plan through it, and where you are hit with a bill this year, there just simply isn't the cash to make it work. And without obviously selling land, and we're just in the viability of the farm business.
In the past, you know, like even before all this, succession planning on farms for the last generation, even with APR, has been a very difficult thing to do. You know, like at the end of the day, we're talking about, like, you know, death and passing on, and your family's heritage, and you've non-farming siblings who maybe need a cut or whatever. like farmers, maybe often didn't make a great job of doing it to begin with. Now you have the tax man in the middle of the whole thing, making it even more complicated, so.
Those discussions no family wants to actually have to have.
I suppose
and recognise the effect that has on it. What's your membership been saying about this, Richard?
Well, we did put a survey out to it, and 100% of them come back that would have a negative effect on the future agriculture. Of that, we got a 65% response rate. So it's very clear that, as I've had how the analogy, our first Agri and Rural Affairs Committee meeting after this was announced, I say I went to more optimistic wakes, is the way I put it, in a sense for young people, like it was, what do we do now? That's really...
Within our organisation, Ulster Farmers Union, when we were getting our head around the implications of this, and NFU were holding an event here in London on the Tuesday the 19th, and we decided to have a rally on the Monday the 18th evening. And so I thought if we had a rally with 2,000 people at it, that would be a very major statement for Northern Ireland, and would run it in conjunction with a petition, and I was hoping for maybe 5,000 names on the petition. We got 15,000 names on the petition and 6,500 people at the rally. And this tax change has been a tipping point for a lot of agriculture right round the UK. They have been feeling under pressure for a very long list of reasons, and this has come along out of the blue, and feeling is running high.
William, I'll stop you there. I'll say order, and we'll resume afterwards. Thank you, colleagues. Off to Order. Right, to resume our evidence session, and the next question is Chris Blow.
Thank you, Chair. Hi, Mr. Irvine again. You've mentioned concerns about the lack of funds for farmers to be able to settle these inheritance bills over the time. And I was just interested if you could comment perhaps a bit more about, I've spoken to a lot of farmers in my constituency. I've seen a lot of books for the last 10 or 15 years, average incomes over those times. And the thing that I couldn't escape was the many, many challenges that farmers are facing in terms of the squeezing of their incomes. Let's say perhaps not the best trade deals than with other countries, poorer standard foods coming into the country from outside interests. Is the problem here, and I know we're having a good conversation about IHT itself, but is it actually also about the fact that farming isn't paying what it should do at the moment and all of those other issues? Because one of my frustrations about this whole conversation is we may come to some compromises, or there might be changes discussed about IHT, but actually we're avoiding the big elephant in the room that at the moment there are so many challenges for farmers that we're doing nothing about.
I couldn't have said it better myself. You're so right on so many fronts, and part of the reason the removal of the APR has been a tipping point, farmers feel under extreme pressure. Society wants them to deliver on so many fronts, and it wants them to deliver with no extra income, and don't make a fuss about it when you're doing it. So all these environmental challenges that actually most of our guys are up for addressing and doing what can be done. But every change and every mitigation takes money. The market needs to reflect that, or else support needs to reflect that. And one of the APR was the big challenge within the budget, but actually for us in Northern Ireland, the removal of the ring fence of the agricultural budget is also a challenge. Now, the mood music at home is quite positive about restoring that ring fence, and we welcome that response from right round the political sphere at home. But the fact remains, the budget we have been allocated is the same budget that has been in place since 2016, I think it is. When you run that through the inflation calculator, we would have needed an extra 50 million to stand still for on-farm support. The budget back in the EU, we had 7-year budgets, which give us a certain amount of security around what support was there for us. Then we had the Conservative government who guaranteed that support for the life of their mandate, which was 5 years, and now we are at a 1-year budget. Now I know next year is going to move forward from that a bit, but a 1-year budget does not give farmers the confidence to make long-term monetary commitments, and that is the crucial point here, and this inheritance tax piece now on top of that, it is the biggest disincentivization for on-farm investment that has come along in years. And that's the sinister side to this. At a point when we could be doing so much for society and moving the whole climate change, all that, and the carbon capture agenda, we have a role to play in all that. Many people don't, but we have, but we can't do it with both hands tied behind our back.
The farm income's one as well. You know, even the dairy figures again, and these are for bigger farms, like 2023, 2024. Average dairy farm 36,000, cereals 11,000, and cattle and sheep around 20,000. So, like as you say, there's very, very, very modest incomes, and these are bigger farms over 0.5 labour units. And I was saying to Claire during an interval there, like I myself, I'm a farmer. I work part time, 3 days a week with the Farmers Journal, and it's effectively, you know, I always wanted to be a farmer. It's to supplement my income, just because on my own upland farm, it just doesn't pay enough for a full-time income support. Just careful too now on the thing about the farm incomes, increasing farm profitability to pay these inheritance tax bills. That's grand, as I say. I'm not against taxation, But there's a broader question than that too, that is it really fair to be paying tax on land, and on land that was bought by your father, grandfather or whatever? Because fundamentally any land that's been bought has been paid for by tax money. So that's why some farmers are so annoyed about this, because the way they look at it, like from their point of view, they've worked their entire life on their farm, they've bought land, expanded, all that's been, like, you're not allowed an allowance on that. If you buy land, you're in debt for your income tax. So it's paid for by taxed money, and at the end of your day, they're saying, actually, we're going to tax you another 40 or 20% on it again. Like, that's just a broader question as well. So I'm not just sure if we lift farm incomes. Obviously, I would love that, but it's not an answer to this issue as well.
It's very much frustration for young people. We are coming into the business. We know, we have to. Younger generation of farmers are very much more environmentally focused. They understand best practice is, yes, more profitable, but also a bit more environmentally friendly in that regard there too. And it's just, as a coin very simply, you can't go green if you're in the red. And ultimately, if farmers, if we want to invest in the best new technologies, be more efficient on farm, there needs to be that incentive there. And ultimately, if you're looking at it, if you potentially have this huge tax bill, right, well, we have to de-invest to ensure we can keep the farm as is, as opposed to, well, how can we expand, how can we invest in what we got and do it better. And as Peter and William said, bring people into the business. Like, I work off farm, there isn't the income to keep me there, and like so many other people, the young farmers, we have our Agri and Rural Affairs Committee, and it's less and less people are able to take their full income from the farm. They're having to supplement it off farm.
Just on that, Richard, could you tell us what that average income is for a young farmer? Do you have that sort of information?
Just like for a young farmer on farm, it depends how much maybe your parents want to pay in some cases, but it's sorry, John William.
Average farm income last year was in the low 30,000. Yeah. And that was on the back of poor produce prices. And it's the volatility of the agriculture markets leaves it extremely challenging. Some years you make money, and then the next 3 years you might do well to break even. And it's that scenario that would give people serious pause for thought if they were taking on a £20,000 or £30,000 loan per year for 10 years to pay a tax bill.
Okay, thanks. We're moving on to David Smith.
Thanks, Chair. I wonder if I might ask a sort of supplementary to the preceding conversation before I go into the question that I'm planning to ask. The government has just is in the process of publishing a defence industrial strategy, which is recognising the place that we're in the world at the moment, and investing in the production of armaments and so on in this country. You maybe think, well, what's this got to do with farming? And I'm just wondering if, and I suspect I know what the answer might be, but I think it's worth a conversation, if you think that farming should be in that bracket of an industry, a sector in society, which really is about our national security.
Well, I think it should be within that conversation. The world is quite frightening at the minute. From the potential of a war point of view, weather events are getting more extreme, which also is a threat. And then there's medical people would say that there is the potential of another pandemic. And any of those three things immediately would put food security front and centre. And I have to say it, at home and even here, everybody gives lip service to food security. But I do not think it significantly impacts on the policies that are developed.
I think
it should be.
I think it's a great strategy. I think if we look at other countries around the world, like for America, for example, food security is national security, and that's very much coming from the USDA, whereas here we're only 58% self-sufficient in food, and it really, it really does question whereby we do need to look at it from a national security point of view, and ultimately what mitigation is what we're trying to do. Like, we only have to look back. If you don't look at your history, you're doomed to repeat it. And certainly in the 1930s, the UK was very relaxed in food security. So I think it's very much front and centre of the agenda.
Thank you. I think it's worth further discussion, but I should probably move on to or take us back to some of the specifics to do with inheritance tax. So this might be covering a ground that we've already covered to a degree, but I think it's actually the nub of the issue here. So there's a difference between the number of farms projected to be affected by inheritance tax coming from different sources. The Treasury, 250 to 500 estates, they're saying. Other sources, whether it be NFU, CVVA, DEFRA, with slightly different figures. And I guess maybe I can address this to Peter, because you've already touched on this. Which source of data provides the most accurate picture? Because it seems to me that that's the real nub of the issue, is how many farms, or estates I should say actually, would be affected by this, and especially in Northern Ireland, obviously.
As I said earlier, I seriously question the accuracy of those figures on historic APR claims, just generally, and I'm not having a go at HMRC, agricultural valuers. I just generally think before it didn't matter, and those figures are, in a lot of cases, are nominal figures, especially for working farms. So before now, the question was, is it a farm? Looks like a farm, sounds like a farm, smells like a farm. It's a farm. It's 100% APR, no problem. Now it's to do with values, and it's completely different. And we haven't done this in a generation. So, and Jeremy and the CAAV have put out their figures saying it's about 5 times more. Instead of 500 a year, 2,500, 75,000 over a 30-year generation. And I think that's what we need to look at, and the DAERA figures are based on market values, and fundamentally from our figures on land values, as a basis on that. So that's what is going to be the tax bills are going to be calculated on going forward, and it's a completely different scenario to where we were in the past. The DAERA analysis as well, even suggests, looking at, they're suggesting around 80,000 hectares a year were claimed under APR, just on very broad, crude, on the amount of money that was claimed divided by the average UK land price, whereas they reckon it should be actually closer to 570,000 hectares, so that's 7 times out. The CAAV are saying we're 5 times out. I think we're out.
Very clear. I don't know if either William or Richard.
Well, I find it interesting, the Treasury's own impact assessment, it talked about 500 farms. Even without crunching the numbers, we didn't feel that was accurate. But every report that has come out since the budget, that as time went on, they had more time and did a more detailed, in-depth report, and every report's getting worse as to what the impact is. And it joins back to food security a bit in this, because the threshold as is proposed gives cover for the smaller farms. The mega farms are well fit to look after themselves, but actually the farms that are getting clobbered here with this are those farms where 2 and 3 family members are relying on the income. And the DAERA figures that just were published last night backs up our assertion that those farms are the farms that actually fill the shelves and put out the bulk of the produce that helps to feed the nation. And those farms are taking an unfair hit here. And this is what really concerns me around the food security. It is threatening those core businesses that keep the meat processors and the milk processors busy and makes the whole operation viable.
Your concern is that the food-producing family farm, they're the ones that are going to be hit most.
Well, if you go back to that there, you're looking at 80% of the farm land in Northern Ireland, if you take the £1 million threshold. And that, yes, 49% of the farms, but it's ultimately is that total farmed, 80% of that farmed area. So that's really what percentage of the food producers will be affected, and that's just a quick example of it.
See, the farm in the DAERA piece, the farms that are over £1 million, They've found that 80% of that covers 80% of total land farmed, 70% of beef cows, 90% of dairy cows, and 80% of total cattle, and about 70% of total sheep. So it is that fundamental core element that feeds the country that's being challenged here.
Final question from each. You suggested earlier, forgive me, I can't remember who said it, but that the majority of farms in Northern Ireland would tend to be owned farms, they'd be their own landlord. Have you anything further to say about that differential between tenants and owner occupiers, as it were, with farmers, but in terms of how this policy might affect in Northern Ireland?
Well, we feel owner occupiers are vulnerable here. And although they're owner occupiers, they own to the general public what seems like quite a nice estate in regards round numbers. But the problem is, and it's was been repeated several times, it's hard to get a living wage out of that business, and you do not. Richard quoted the 0.5% return on investment. It's wafer thin, and a good year comes along and people invest for the future, and as they've done that over the generations, because we'll tighten our belt a bit, but the farm will be in a better place for the next generation. But now the next generation has a huge question mark hanging over it.
And that's just something too. Like, at the end of the day, this non-inquiry session is about the impact of the autumn budget in Northern Ireland, and unfortunately, that's just one thing. And I love in my job with backing things up with figures, but that is one thing we can't back up with figures, and it is this: that no harm to our friends in England, Scotland, and Wales, but farmers in Northern Ireland and in the Republic of Ireland have a serious, strong attachment to the land. Like, we're owner occupied. Small farms pass from generation to generation, and that attachment to the land defines the whole structure of farming. It goes back 100 years to the first Irish Land Acts. It's why our farms are smaller than they are in the rest of the UK, because we had the opportunity, the peasant farmers had the opportunity to buy back off the bigger landowners. And fundamentally, that's why we have that attachment, and that's why we're well rooted in the land. That's why our backs are up so much about this, because that's under threat now. Having to sell off a whack of land that your maybe grandfather bought. My farm's, I'm third generation, 75 years. Seems like a long time. Actually, in the case of a lot of farming families in Northern Ireland, it's not long at all. And as far as I'm concerned, we're only getting started. I don't want to be the last person on the land. Certainly, that's what every farmer is thinking. We think in terms of generations, not years.
William?
It's a pity that Jeremy Moody of the Central Association of Auctioneers and Valuers couldn't join with us today. They have done 2 significant papers on this, and they are the guys that are involved in the transfer of estates and really know what they're talking about here. So we will lodge the papers with the committee after this session, so that everybody can see it. But I think when they talk about 2,500 farms annually, and 75 over a generation, that I think that is an accurate assessment of what we're looking at here, and that spells devastation. And within that's when deaths and generational changes happen in their order. You could have an unexpected death, health accident, whatever. You could have a family farm business having 2 deaths closer together than the standard 30 years of a generation. And they might cling on the first time by the skin of their teeth, but if they get hit again inside 10 years or 15 years, there's not a chance that they could survive that.
Ultimately, you're ending up, we've done a lot of work with young farmers, or Yellow Wellies Farm Safety Partnership. You are working in the most dangerous industry in the UK, and we all sit in this front desk. We all know people who've been killed or badly maimed in farm accidents. Nobody's immune to that. There in the 7-year rule is putting a lot of strain in that regard.
Okay, thank you, Gavin Robinson.
Thank you, William. I think it was a good point about Jeremy Moody's information not being available, you'll send that through. I think it would also be worthwhile if he were able to review the Hansard transcript, that perhaps he could comment on all of the issues today.
Just for you for the committee to know, and for the people here to know, I have asked one of the clerks to contact Jeremy. He is listening, and if we could have a written response, it would be very useful.
I think that'd be useful.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And I think, William, you had said from the Ulster Farmers Union perspective at the Agriculture Committee last week that there's an urgency for specific data. And since then, we've had the letter from the Dairy Minister, and we've talked about some of the other sources available. Is that picture getting better?
It's getting more complete, and the story that is emerging could not be described as better. It's getting, as more in-depth analysis being carried out, the situation actually gets more alarming. And this. Back to one of the auctioneer and valuer's points, because of the historic lead up to this point, they did not do the calculation with the correct baseline figures or accurate baseline figures, and that wasn't anybody's fault. That was because up to the 40 years that have led up to this point did not require those accurate figures, and HMRC actually advised, no, well, it's not relevant to what's happening here, we'll just move on through on old valuations.
And if you say we're getting a more complete picture, though it's bleak, what's absent and yet would be required to give a complete picture? What data set would it be important to have that we just currently don't have the ability to review at this stage?
Within last night's DERA paper, they are taking an assumption on who actually, within the farm business, who actually owns the collateral. Now, I'm convinced they are taking the right assumption on that, but as of yet they haven't the core data to verify that assumption. As to the no incomes and the fair handle on values, but unless you know individual farm situations, you don't know actually who owns who is the landowner.
Peter, you were looking at me there as if you.
No, I would agree that is probably the issue, and it's honestly very difficult to get a handle on that. I don't know where, unless it's some sort of survey, or if anyone has that data, if they want to exclusively give it to the Farmers Journal first, we can reveal it to that. It'd be great.
You got to read Ernie's Belfast at the weekend. That's good going. I hope this isn't an unfair question, but we've talked about the threats, the dangers, the lack of data, maybe the misunderstanding to Northern Ireland's perspective over England, Scotland and Wales. Have any of you, over the last number of weeks since the budget was passed, got any sense that whether it's a screeching U-turn or a reversal that makes sense for farmers, that there will be a positive outcome in the short term with this issue?
By the very fact that I'm a lifetime in agriculture, I'm an eternal optimist. But there's no real indication yet. Now, I think if we can succeed in meeting the Chancellor and laying out our case, as I say, I'm always the eternal optimist. But the government has shown every indication of digging in on this issue, and it's still all to play for. Yeah, and we're still at our work.
Peter, you talked about some changes that wouldn't be embarrassing for government, would allow them to limit the impact. Have you had a chance to think, because you think about these issues and you write about them quite extensively, whether that would have material detriment to what the government have planned to raise through these relief changes?
I'm not sure. Yeah, I suppose like they're talking about 500 million a year, but at the end of the day, we're fairly certain that their figures around who's all affected is wrong. So probably wrong too. You know what I mean? So I'm not sure if it would affect the tax intake that much, but fundamentally it doesn't matter. It was a 22 billion they're going to raise by the national insurance thing. So to 500 million. So it's not a huge. My first reaction when I seen this was, this is not worth the fight. For all in terms of government spending, this is not worth there's been such a kickback about this, alienate the rural community as a whole. It's not worth the bother. Like, you know, that was my initial reaction. Like, I'm not. So I think that still stands. Making some of these even adjustments around up on the threshold, having a clawback tax instead of a tax on every death, or as I say, amend that 7-year rule, and even that real simple one of making the APR transferable between spouses. Like, you know, it's all those will be certainly useful. And as William says, the government appear to be digging in on it to an extent, but I do think that fundamentally that they're giving people advice on how to avoid this, you know, so it makes me think actually they maybe realise themselves that it's not right, and they're giving some advice on how to get around it, so a bit more would be very useful. Like.
And we as an organisation, we're concerned about the future of our members here. We're not really out to be demanding screeching U-turns. Just we need a workable solution here.
Yeah. Thank you. Richard, do you want to add anything?
Well, just there's so many opportunities here to maybe bring it in this sense. Currently in the format, it's not going to work for young people, or if it's discussed here today. But ultimately, well, how can we maybe look at Europe and how they do it to young people, succession planning? Like as I said, look, we all need our public services, and everything needs to be properly funded. But as Peter's mentioned, like, how much pain are we going to go through for the sake of this 500 million? And ultimately, for someone HMRC hasn't looked at for 40 years, what level of investment is going to be to get there? So ultimately, what is the overall tax take going to be out of this?
Thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, Gavin. Sorcha Eastwood.
Thank you, Chair. It's great to have you here today. We've been waiting for this session because it's so important. And you talked about the rally which was held in my constituency in Lagan Valley, and our small family farm is literally just across the ditch from there. And Peter, what you said about the emotion and the attachment to land is so important, and my heart genuinely breaks whenever I think about the other families that may be completely not just priced out per se, but the damage that this will do. We do incredible work with schools in my constituency, Dromore High being one of them. Fantastic work in bringing on that next generation, and then this is how they're repaid. And Richard, you spoke briefly from the floor that night at the rally, along with many others, and it would be remiss of me if I didn't say that everybody really owes you and your generation a credit in what you're doing. And I think, William, your point around the food security is a point that's really well made, particularly when we know where we're going in terms of a geopolitical sense. Peter, in response there to Gavin, you had said that the government was giving people advice on how to avoid it, and that's sort of what this substantial question is about. Do you really think that advice from government is in any shape or form meaningful, or do you think it reflects more what you said, which is that they know that they've maybe called this wrong?
One of the things he said last week in that debate was they kept giving this example of a £5 million farm, and that farm could be owned by 5 different people, £1 million each, no inheritance tax. And you think, okay, is that the advice that we're suggesting, that you break up farms, you bring in all these different family members, and as William says, most of them are sole ownered in Northern Ireland anyway. Like, it just gets very messy very quickly when you start doing this, you know, and it's just not, to date, it hasn't been the advice of any farm advisor, you know, or tax expert or solicitor looking at passing farm from generation to generation. So certainly, like, what other business would you do that? And as I say, if that relief isn't transferable, are you going to have 5 different people dying at 5 different stages? And it's just a mess. Like, and as I say, this was a complicated enough issue within families to begin with. Like, so it's just been made a lot worse, especially with that sort of recommendation.
Mm-hmm. Go ahead, William.
Yeah. One of the conversations we had in the early days of this was with a guy who's a member of the Agricultural Law Association in Northern Ireland. I think I'm right in saying he's been practicing law for 20 years, and this is a week or more ago, and the Treasury were making a big play that actually the 1 million really meant 3 billion, and he said, well, that's all very well, but in my 27 years I know of no family that would have ticked all those boxes to have achieved the 3 million threshold. You know, so it's very... families aren't tidy units, you know.
Surely.
they come in all forms, and you would be very lucky to avail of all the the work-throughs that are being touted as reasons to let this go forward.
Yeah.
I think a lot of the examples are very much in the hypothetical. Like they're very much removing the one element of it, and that's a human factor. In all these agreements, I don't know one that would split the thing 5 ways and everybody's happy in that regard. And that's really, and as William said, like, they haven't found one example with that 3 million threshold in 27 years. So I would put it to the government, name us an example.
Yeah, 100%.
And I just very much doubt they've found one.
Yeah, and I suppose that leads on to the next point then, which is about the data and how important it is to evidence. And Peter, you've already worked up and gone through a number of very detailed scenarios. And William, you alluded to the fact there that DAERA have in fact now published some figures which have, I feel, brought us on in a way. I do think, well, I know the Minister is seized of the importance of this back home, but I also know that it is going to be a challenge to try and get some of that data and that information. But would you agree with that contention that this new figures published does actually help us move forward in terms of evidence in Northern Ireland's situation?
Absolutely, and we thank the Minister and DAERA for doing this piece of work. And it confirms the point I made earlier. It's those core farms that produce more than half of the food that are adversely impacted here. And as I said, that brings you back to the food security question. And the viability of the processors opening their door and switching the lights on of a morning.
Yeah.
The whole system works on throughput.
Yeah.
And to meet demand. And once you start reducing that throughput for any reason, then it puts in question the whole process.
Exactly, and I think what probably comes across strongly from today for anybody watching is that there was absolutely no conversation prior to this. It was a bolt out of the blue, a terrible bolt out of the blue. And I think what's refreshing is for people that don't maybe necessarily understand just how important this is, not just in economic and social terms, but that actually everybody is coming forth with really reasonable solutions and suggestions. And I think the work that you're doing on behalf of everybody in Northern Ireland in farming is so greatly appreciated. And it's great that you've been here today to make the case.
We really welcome the opportunity to be here, to have our voice.
Yeah, important.
Gerald Pinkerton.
Thank you, Chair. I'm going to be putting a little bit of the words of the Treasury to you, and I already recognise in the panel that there's some distrust in what the Treasury have been saying around this issue, but let me just put the point to you that they're using to justify these changes. And that is that they claim that 1/3 of the properties that are going to be subject to 1/3 of APR property, so agricultural property relief claims, relate to estates that are used as investment portfolios set up to minimise inheritance tax liabilities. That's the claim that the Treasury make. Do you recognise that characterisation of estates, of farms in your part of the world?
Not at all. When I hear that, I think of 10,000 acre estates in here in some part of England. We tend not to have those. Average farm size 100 acres, small family farms, and that's what we're here trying to protect. Yeah, we don't recognise that scenario at all.
You might say that.
And even the work by Tax Policy Associates has kind of blew that argument apart too. So if a third of the ones that are affected are people that are avoiding tax, that means 2/3 of the farms affected are actually working active farmers. So by the Treasury admitting that themselves at this stage. But like as William says, we're looking at Northern Ireland here in this session, and truthfully, like in the land report here that we do, we haven't seen that. There is the odd exception, somebody buying a whack of land that maybe isn't properly a farmer or whatever, but certainly that has not been happening in Northern Ireland to the extent at all parts of the UK. And our magazine, I refer to it as business people with farming interests potentially buying land, And there may be fundamentally someone who is from farming stock or has a small farm, but who's done well with farm diversification or another business, and has decided to use the money to increase their farm, and that's probably fair enough. Like, it's not Jeremy Clarkson or Dyson, you know, it's still that farming type of person, you know, buying land in Northern Ireland. Like.
We have many characters within Northern Ireland farming, but they're not called.
Well, it sort of backs up Peter's point. Certainly within my job, I work with a lot of farmers, and you would find that there people ultimately, many spouses on the farm, there wasn't enough income to support them on the farm. They maybe do well in business or another career, and ultimately their always driving passion is to go into farming, and they are using that off-farm income to buy land to go into farming, for it always was their passion. So I would, it's very, I think it was a very different example from Northern Ireland to GB in that example.
I had a feeling that might be your answer, but we had to ask the question to establish that as a kind of baseline piece of evidence. And I just wish that Jeremy Moody could have been here joining us online, because I think he would have been able to contribute some clarity to that question as well. Let me then just put another question, a follow-up to you. And given that policy does apply to GB and NI, Can you imagine, can you see a scenario, could you develop a policy that would target those investment portfolios where arguably money is being shielded for future generations, whilst also not adversely attacking farms such as those that are held by the communities that you represent? Is there a way through this for the government? Can you offer any advice or help to the government? If they have got a listening mindset on right now, can you see a way both to tackle that challenge that they face in terms of those big estates in, let's say, England, and possibly Scotland as well, whilst protecting farms such as those in your communities?
I think if we sat round the table, there would be a solution there. One of the frustrations with what the current proposal is that for those big entities that are buying the larger blocks of land, it's still worth their while, because they're getting £1 million threshold and a 50% reduction in tax following that £1 million. So there's still advantage for those wealthy entities to do that, and the family farms that we represent would be quite happy to see that door closed.
Mm-hmm. The best example I've seen so far is that one around to have a clawback mechanism, so have that threshold very, very high, so it'll allow all working family farms through, and even allow some of our friends who are buying it for tax avoidance reasons through. But if the next generation cash it in, sell it, then hit them with inheritance tax, because they'll have the cash to pay for it.
Well, it goes back to the point, like, again, we go to Europe. I think certainly, like Germany, for example, if you do inherit a family farm and you are farming it for 7 years, you are exempt from that. And I think there is ways and means to go around this here that's beneficial for ultimately food producers and farmers. And I think, as William said, it was very good to be involved in that conversation. Unfortunately, we weren't involved at the start of this.
Mm-hmm. Yes, David.
No, please, David, come in.
Okay.
Dr. Al's permission. I'm interested on the clawback mechanism. Presumably, though, that then requires, as what's been described elsewhere, as that sort of active farmer test or designation to identify who is this middle ground of family farmers. What do you think would be the best way to create that definition?
Historically, even back in their membership with the EU Union, we all struggled with a definitive definition of what an active farmer is. But possibly 80% of your income or something like that. But it is hard to define.
Is there a feature that has to do with longevity and demonstrating the longevity over a generation or a decade or whatever, pick a number, of farming on in that location?
That's back to the 7-year piece that happens in Germany. If the next generation continues to farm for 7 years, then their tax liability is nil.
But just to be clear, what
I
I'm
think,
suggesting,
Peter, you're suggesting that if you were to cash out,
exactly,
you'd get clobbered.
So
But if you
need an
didn't
active
sell the
farmer.
land,
It's basically, I suppose, a type of capital gains tax, almost, or by a different term. But like, I think the vast majority of farmers would no issue with that, because that's the issue. We're not cashing it; we're trying to hold on to it.
Okay, thank you. I'd just like to ask, William, you said the mood music was good about the restoring the ring fencing. So you think the executive are going to agree? When do you expect that to happen? What kind of time scale?
It was hinted that it might actually happen prior to breaking up for the Christmas break. I'm not aware. I'm not just sure if that's feasible or not. But there is a draft budget that early in the new year, and if it was within that, then it would happen. But and while we would welcome that, there is it has been talked about for a good while now about a just transition fund to help deal with the environmental challenges. And while we would welcome the on-farm support coming and being ring-fenced, as I stated earlier, it is an old sum that inflation has devalued to a huge extent, and this term of a just transition fund, that will only be a just fund if it is new money, because we are being asked to do new things with it.
The Secretary of State for the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, Steve Reid, did say to the House that devolved administrations should have the right to take decisions about their own countries. Do you think that that's a positive step forward for the government to put discretion over agricultural funding in the hands of the Northern Ireland Executive?
What's the executive under a certain amount of pressure, because they have many difficult decisions to make. The utilities are underinvested probably right round the UK. We are definitely no different and probably worse behind that loop. So it makes us in agriculture nervous that there's some challenges there that there's some arguments hard to win if you go head to head with education or health. So so we're nervous of this. Whenever it was targeted money for agriculture sent across to Northern Ireland, that gave us confidence to move forward, and it has removed that confidence.
Okay.
Maybe it goes back to the point we talked about earlier, coming from Parliament in the UK, food security, in the sense of each the four nations involved are funded for that there. It's a national issue as opposed to regional in that regard, and particularly you take Northern Ireland, we feed 10 million people and a population of 1.8. I think that's something worth protecting.
Okay, thank
and
you.
6 million, we feed 10 million, but 6 million of those people live in GB, and we feed ourselves, and then there's exports to ROA and mainland Europe. So we're a significant. Sorry, Peter. We're a significant part of the whole UK food security piece.
Yeah.
There maybe is a benefit in it, as William says, if we could get a new ring fence within Northern Ireland, because just as me looking on as a journalist, particularly how the handling of this has been done in England with new farm schemes and even Wales, I would not, the lads have said in publicly before they wouldn't want to be a part of that, or it's just the way it's been handled. It hasn't been farmer friendly at all, and there is that political appetite at Stormont across all parties to support farmers. So it's just sometimes I think actually if we could get that ring fence within Stormont, it means we're not going back. For example, the budget did announce there that the English support's only for another 2 years, is 5 billion. So I'm just thinking, if that was the case across the whole of the UK, in 2 years' time we'd be all chewing our nails again, wondering, are they going to give us any money? So at least now it actually is baselined in the block grant. If we can keep it there within farming, it's probably beneficial.
Within Northern Ireland, the fact that the First and Deputy First Minister, our Minister of Agriculture, and I think it's our Finance Minister, have all signed a joint letter to the Chancellor highlighting how exposed Northern Ireland agriculture is in this. For a round table approach from Northern Ireland, that's a very significant statement in my view for everybody to come together on the one page on this issue. It doesn't always happen within Northern Ireland.
Thank you, Richard, William and Peter. I'd like to thank you for your contribution today, and I want you to know that every member of this committee agreed to take in this session today in advance of the EFRA committee tomorrow, which I will be guesting on tomorrow morning. So thank you very much for your time. Order, order.